Stories from the home front bright, keeping victory shining light on the victory home front.
Hello to all the Rosies and Homefront Joes, and welcome back to another episode of On the Victory Homefront. Today we are starting a 5-part series because if you're going to talk about the U.S. Homefront during World War II, there are multiple sides. Yes, of course, during America, we know one thing that inspires most of us is the unity of the home front, the hardworking citizens of America that did everything they could for the duration of the war to get our country through the war, to have our boys be victorious in the war, and for, of course, for us to win. And I think, of course, when I think of the World War II homefront myself, that is the first thing that comes to mind is the unity, the women going to work, the Rosie the Riveter image, and the signs of patriotism everywhere. But in this 5-part series, we're going to explore the hidden challenges that threaten morale in the U.S. during World War II, because the battle for victory wasn't fought only overseas. It was also fought in American homes. It was fought on our home front. And so today's episode is the first part of the series, and we are going to look at the voices of doubt, propaganda, and the psychological war. So when we imagine the American home front during World War II, as I just stated, the picture often seems very clear, very inspiring. You can see the factory whistles blowing as the workers pour into massive plants to produce tanks and aircrafts, ammunition and bombs, and women stepping into the industrial jobs as Rosie the Riveter, Winnie the Welder, and families planting victory gardens in backyards and in city parks, the communities saving scrap metal and rubber to support the war effort. This is the story that we often hear. It's the one of unity and determination. It's a nation fully mobilized and standing together. And in many ways, that story is true. But the reality of wartime America was more complicated because behind those patriotic posters, behind the radio speeches, the American home front faced enormous pressure. Our morale was constantly tested. There was fear and exhaustion, social tensions, shortages, and even enemy propaganda that all threatened to weaken the national spirit that the war effort depended on. And today, we're taking a deeper look at one of those hidden struggles. And it's not the battles fought in Normandy or the Pacific Islands, but it's a quieter battle fought in American homes, factories, and cities. It's the battle to maintain morale on the home front. And this first episode focuses on one of the most unusual attacks on American morale, and it was voices carried over the radio. In 1940s, the radio was the most powerful mass communication tool in the world. Nearly every American home had one, and families would gather around it for news updates, music programs, comedy shows, kids shows, and presidential speeches. And when the U.S. entered World War II, radio became one of the main ways that Americans would follow the progress of the war. They would get battle reports from Europe, updates from the Pacific, speeches from President Roosevelt. And the radio signals didn't just stop at our national borders, though. The Axis powers knew that, and they used it to their advantage because they thought and knew that if radio could reach American homes, it could be used as a weapon. Enter one of the most infamous propaganda voices during World War II, and that belonged to a woman named Mildred Gillers. She was an American actress who had been living in Germany when the war began. And eventually, she began broadcasting for German radio. Her programs were aimed directly at American soldiers and listeners back home. and the American troops quickly gave her a nickname, Axis Sally. Her broadcasts often sounded friendly at first. She played popular American music, music that was actually banned in Germany. She spoke in relaxed conversational English, but between songs, she delivered propaganda designed to shake American confidence. Now, I did some research on her, of course, and she framed her broadcasts around the idea that the American home front was collapsing morally and emotionally while soldiers were fighting overseas. One of the most consistent themes in her Home Sweet Home Hour program was the idea that women at home were being unfaithful. And so typical broadcast themes included women dancing with other men while soldiers were away, girlfriends forgetting the men fighting overseas, and soldiers returning home to find relationships destroyed. An example theme in her broadcast was questioning whether American women would still love their soldiers if you boys came home mutilated. And the purpose of these kinds of episodes were to make soldiers angry or resentful towards civilians, and it was to break emotional ties between soldiers and home. Now, another way that Axis Sally used her voice against the U.S., the home front, and our boys is she often described soldiers dying for the benefit of wealthy politicians and businessmen. So an example messaging would be that Roosevelt and Churchill were sending soldiers to die, and the war would not benefit ordinary Americans. This message was meant to influence families back home, encouraging resentment toward the war effort. She would also exploit casualty reports. She frequently reported American losses, sometimes exaggerating them. And typical themes were large bomber losses, soldiers dying in Europe, and ships sunk in the Atlantic. Her goal for those were to make families believe their sons or husbands were likely dead or doomed. This tactic was commonly in Nazi psychological warfare broadcasts directed at Allied countries. Her motive was simple. She tried to plant simple but powerful ideas that the war was hopeless, that we should not be supporting the war effort. One of her most infamous broadcasts was actually the Vision of Invasion broadcast in 1944. And it targeted our home front morale. She performed a dramatic radio play about the D-Day invasion. In this play, obviously it's a fictional story of an American soldier killed in battle, leaving behind a grieving wife and mother. The mother dreams her son has died during the invasion, and the dead soldier describes horrific battlefield suffering. And this was to frighten the American families about the coming invasion and make them fear that their sons would die. It was also used against the soldiers that were going to be part of this invasion, making them think that they were all going to be slaughtered. This broadcast was so infamous, it was actually used against her in her. But Germany was not alone in using radio propaganda. In the Pacific, Japan also broadcast English language programs. They were aimed specifically at our American troops. And these broadcasts were nicknamed also by our soldiers, and it was nicknamed Tokyo Rose. Now, the Japanese propaganda was slightly different because it focused heavily on emotional separation between soldiers and home. And many Tokyo Rose broadcasts try to convince soldiers that Americans back home had forgotten them. Now, Tokyo Rose wasn't one woman. In reality, it was several different women participating in these programs. But like the German broadcasts, these shows mixed music with commentary. So they played American jazz and swing records, and then the broadcasters would make sarcastic remarks about American military setbacks. They talked about ships sunk in the Pacific, and they suggested that the war would drag on endlessly. One of the ways that the Tokyo Rose broadcast really targeted soldiers was they would open up some of their broadcasts as, "Hello, you fighting orphans." And that phrase was to imply that the U.S. had abandoned them and that their families had moved on. And it was to make soldiers feel disconnected from the home front. They often would suggest the civilians were enjoying life while soldiers suffered. Example themes for the Tokyo Rose was civilians dancing, parties, and nightlife, people unconcerned about soldiers overseas. Many American troops actually did tune in to these broadcasts, but often they listened out of curiosity rather than belief. Some even treated the programs as entertainment. Both propaganda campaigns targeted the emotional bond between soldiers and home. The psychological warfare planners believed that morale depended on three things: belief the war was worth fighting, trust in leadership, and connection to family and home. Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose tried to attack all three simultaneously. But despite the attention they received, historians generally agree that Axis propaganda had very little success in actually weakening the American morale. Even if the broadcasts were ineffective, which thankfully they were, they still revealed something important, and that is that World War II was one of the first truly modern propaganda wars. Nazi Germany invested enormous resources in shaping public opinion. Hitler's minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, I may have mispronounced that, he believed that controlling information could influence the outcome of the war. And that logic is pretty simple. Armies do not fight alone. They depend on entire societies and nations behind them. They depend on their factory workers, the families, the communities. And if you could weaken the confidence of those people, you could weaken the army that they supported. So therefore, the American home front was seen as a legitimate target. Now, thankfully, enemy propaganda was not the greatest threat to American morale. The real challenges came actually from inside the U.S. It came from the realities of wartime, life itself. Families worried about loved ones overseas. Casualty reports arrived in newspapers and telegrams. Rationing changed everyday life. There were illegal black markets that popped up. And there was violence and racial tensions that erupted in American cities. Rumors spread fear and uncertainty, and as the war dragged on, exhaustion began to take its toll. These pressures created the real battle for morale on the American home front. Now, the coming episode of this series, we're going to explore those pressures in detail, because while soldiers fought overseas, millions of Americans were fighting a different kind of battle at home, a battle to keep faith in a war effort, a battle to ensure sacrifice and uncertainty, a battle to hold the home front together until victory finally came. So next time here on the Victory Home Front, we're going to look at one of the most emotional and personal pressures of wartime America, and that is the fear of casualty reports, the arrival of the telegram, and the way entire communities lived with the uncertainty of war. Because for many families, the war wasn't something happening far away. It was something that could arrive at their very front door. This is a very emotional series that I hope you will follow along with me for all 5 parts. And this is something that's very important to look into, because it's not something that is mentioned as much when it comes to our World War II home front. So until next time, my friends, I hope you're having a great day, a great week, and remember, victory is in the everyday.